In this video, we'll be focusing on utilizing JavaScript to manipulate the DOM. And we're going to learn a few of the methods for acquiring handles, or what are called references, to DOM elements, or elements that live inside of the document object model. That is the digital representation of the HTML that was loaded into the browser. All right, so in this particular video, what we're going to do is we are going to use the DOM example that we had from the first video where we learned about the HTML browser, DOM, and JavaScript and how they work together. We never did actually execute that project during the video, but we are going to be using it during this one. So please make sure that you download the additional project resource called DOM example. It's a zipped archive that contains an HTML website, a very basic HTML website. And we're going to be using the HTML and the JavaScript files that live within that project in this example. So if you want to walk through this with me and you want to practice using these new JavaScript functions that we learned today, make sure you download and then unzip that archive so that you have this DOM example folder. It should have 2 HTML files in it, a CSS file, and then 2 JavaScript files. To get started, we're going to go ahead and open up that project in Visual Studio Code. So open up Visual Studio Code, click on Open Folder, and then go to wherever it is that you stored that particular folder on your hard drive. In this case, I have it inside of my screencast folders, and then DOM example. So I select the folder as the root of my project. I should see all of my files come up in the Project Explorer on the left-hand side of the screen. And to begin with, let's just go ahead and open up the index.html. This is the same HTML structure that we went through in that last video. So what we're going to do is we are actually going to do some live coding, and we're going to do it directly in the browser so that we can see not only the structure of the HTML in the Chrome developer tools, but we are going to execute JavaScript code against the DOM that represents that HTML. And we're going to do that in the console. So once you have the index.html open, go ahead and right click on it, and you should have a launch on browser option right here. If you don't, that's because you haven't installed the extension yet. So go over here to the left hand side of your screen, click on extensions, and you should see right here preview on web server. So preview on web server is the plugin you should have installed. So make sure you go ahead and install that. Once you have it installed, go back to your Project Explorer, open up your index.html, and then you should have it right here, Launch on Browser. So we're going to go ahead and click Launch on Browser, and we should have our very basic, very generic HTML page load in our browser. And then we are going to go ahead and open up the developer tools. And right here in the developer tools, I have mine using a dark theme instead of the light theme. You can do that by going through the preferences right here and go to settings. And in settings, I choose the dark theme just because all of my IDEs, everything, and the dark with white text actually hurts my eyes less as a developer. And you'll find that a lot of developers use dark themes on their applications, their IDEs, and the tools they use, just because it hurts your eyes less. And when you're staring at a computer screen all day long, every day for 8 hours programming, whatever you can do to reduce eye strain is awesome. So make sure you do that if you're experiencing headaches or eye strain. Start using dark themes. All right, so enough of that. Let's go ahead and talk about this. So as we've used the Chrome developer tools, there's an entire video introducing you to these tools. So if you haven't gone through that video yet, you might want to pause right now, go to that video, and become comfortable with the developer tools before you continue this video, because we're going to be using them a lot. So if we click on the Elements tab, you will see the entire HTML structure that looks almost identical to what we have in our HTML file. So that is the imported, interpreted, and compiled representation of our HTML. It is also the digital representation of the DOM. So if we go back to our DOM example right here, our diagram, we see the DOM tree right here, And again, this right here represents the DOM that is in the browser. And you can tell that it represents the DOM because once you're in the Chrome Developer Tools, if you go click on a particular section, you will actually see a highlight over here on the HTML. So this is our DOM, and this is our console where we're going to execute code against that DOM. In this video, what we're going to focus on is how do we, in JavaScript, identify or locate a particular element. So let's say this UL, this unordered list element right here. How do we get JavaScript to get a reference to that particular element so that we can do something to it, so that we can modify it, update it, alter it, do what we need to it in order to modify what is seen by the user. So how do we do that? And we're gonna learn about that today, and we're gonna focus on right now, let's modify the content of this paragraph or p tag. So we're gonna focus on this p tag. We know that the p tag lives in the hierarchy under this section tag, and we know that the section tag has an ID. So if we remember from HTML and our CSS lessons, the ID tag on an HTML element is a unique identifier, and there should only be one element in the entire HTML document that has an ID with this value, and right now the value is intro. So we should reliably be able to assume that the section with the ID of intro is 100% unique to our document, and there is not another one. So this would allow us to get a handle or a reference to this section element. But what we really want is this p tag. And so what we're going to do is we are going to learn about a function that is provided to us, that is provided through JavaScript and the browser, called query selector. And the query selector function lives on our DOM. So cool thing is we've been talking a lot about the document object model, which is our awesome tree right here. Well, this tree is actually represented in JavaScript by an object called document. This one right here. And if you look at it, if you pull it up in your JavaScript, you'll see the cool thing is that it is actually the DOM. And so you can pull it apart and open it up, and if we look right here, we've got that section called intro, and there's our p tag that we're after. So not only does the DOM live right here in the browser and provide us the rendered view in the window, JavaScript also, through this object called document that is given to us, allows us to actually have the entire DOM accessible inside of our JavaScript. So now, because the document gives us the entire document, that's little help to us. But as I was saying, there is a function or a method on the document object that provides us the ability to query the document or search through the document and actually look for what we're looking for, or get a handle on what we're looking for. So as always in JavaScript, the whole intention is that we are trying to get a chunk of data, a reference to something, a piece of data. And what we're looking for is an element. So we're going to need something to store it in. So we're going to go ahead and create ourselves a variable. So let, and we're looking for a paragraph. And then we're going to do document dot query selector. And then in here, inside of the parentheses is where we're going to put our parameter, and the parameter that the query selector takes is a query string. And the cool thing about this query selector function on the document in JavaScript is that it follows the same kind of queries or querying that happens in CSS. So if you have been practicing your CSS, as I hope you have been, you'll understand how CSS sets its rules on HTML documents. And that's usually through, IDs, classes, or element names themselves. So As we discussed when we were looking at this, when we were looking at the DOM, we know that under HTML, inside of the body, we want the section that has an ID of intro, and we want the p tag, which is a direct child or descendant of this section tag with the ID intro. Cool thing is that using CSS selectors inside of our query selector as a string, we can do just that. So we can say $, which, as we know from CSS selectors, represents the ID, and we can say intro, and then we want a direct descendant. So we want the child, which is a paragraph tag of the section. So a direct descendant, well, we can do that using the greater than sign, and then the P, which stands for the P tag or paragraph tag. And because we put that into the paragraph variable, we should have a reference inside of paragraph that references that exact element inside of our document. So let's check that out. Let's go ahead and see what our paragraph is. So I went ahead and just told JavaScript by calling that variable to show me what's inside of there. And you can see, as it highlights over here, we have a live reference, or we have an active reference to that P element that is sitting inside of our document. So a really cool thing here is that it's live, meaning that we have that direct reference within the DOM to that element, and we can update it in real time. And we talked about this when we looked at this diagram the other day in that last video, where JavaScript will make a call to the DOM. Oh, it's not. Let's go ahead and pull this over here. Oh. My screen ink was off the page. There we go. So JavaScript will make a call to the DOM with that query string. The DOM will go through, it will look for that section with that ID, and then it'll get us that element. And the cool thing is that when it passes that element back to us, we have that full-blown link directly to that object right there, to that element. And what that means is that the second we make an update to that element, we're going to see that reflected over here. So let me move my screen ink down here. All right. So we have seen how to get a single HTML element using CSS query style strings as the actual queries for the query selector. Now, let's see what we can do when we want to get more than one element. So query selector, just so we know, when we call document.querySelector, this particular function will always bring back the first element that meets this query, the CSS query. So it will always pull back the first element that meets that. Now what that means is that using query selector, you only get one element back, and you always get the first element that meets the query requirement. So if we jump back here and we look at our HTML, if I am trying to get a handle on all of the table data or TD elements, and I want all of them so that I can iterate over them and do something, using query selector, what will end up happening is I will get one of these based on the search algorithm that the JavaScript or that the JavaScript DOM uses to locate an element. So it could be one of these TDs, but I will only get one back. So let's go ahead and try that. Let's do a document.query. So let's capture that element, right? Table data equals document query selector, and then I am just going to ask for the TD. And you might assume, being new to JavaScript, that this will get us back all of the table datas, But the reality is it's going to get us back only 1. And if we look at that table data, it gets us the very first one in our hierarchy within that table. And it only gives us back 1. And we see that it is the name table data. So go back to our hierarchy, we'll see that it actually pulled us back this one right here. And then if we look at our HTML, we'll see that it gave us back the very first TD out of all of our HTML. So if we want to get back all of the table data, what we need to do is we need to use document.querySelectorAll. And in document.querySelectorAll, this one will allow us to get all of the TDs back in an array. And we see right here. Now we have back every single TD that we were looking for. And you can see if you expand this, there are a lot of attributes and a lot of stuff given to you by JavaScript for this particular element. And you can see these elements have a lot of functionality. If you noticed, I clicked on the very first TD and I expanded the arrow. And you can all see there's just a ton of events that we can subscribe to, and we'll get to events later, but a lot of functionality that we have to play with. So let's look at just the first TD. So if I do table data, and then I ask for the first one using this array syntax, you'll see, yep, I got back the name. And if I ask for the last one, which is the 11, table data, let's ask for 11, you'll see that I got 21.7, which is the very last one. And you'll see that they are in order of how they were read from our HTML. So obviously the search within the DOM by JavaScript follows the exact same order the DOM was constructed from that HTML document. So that's really good to know. That gives you some understanding of how the searches happen so that when you're searching for elements within the DOM, you understand how the searching happens. So query selector allows you to get a single element, and you can be very specific in your queries by using IDs or classes and then asking for child elements. And then you can also use query selector all in order to pull out all of the information or find all of the elements that match a particular query. Another cool thing we can do is we've seen, let's see, we've got ourselves using an ID and a regular element tag. We've used another element tag. So let's do another one and let's use a class tag. So let's see, inside of our example HTML, do we have any elements that are of a particular class? We don't have any. So let's go update our HTML really quick. And let's say that this TR has a class of table header. So we're going to use that as a class. So make sure you add that before you reload. We'll need to reload our page. And now we should see in here, oh, no, I'm in the wrong section. We need to go down to our section that has the table in it. There's the table header. And now this table row, I added the class table header. So if we go to console, we should be able to use let's go ahead and, well, we're not going to grab a reference to it. We're just going to let the console spit out what it is. So document.querySelector, and then let's pull out an ID. So to get an ID, it's just like CSS queries. You're going to say ID and then table header. Go ahead and hit enter, and we'll see that it actually pulled back the exact table row that has a class of table header. And we got back the first one that fits this query. All right, so we've learned the basic querying of the DOM using query selector, which allows us to get the first element that meets the query requirements, and then query selector all, which allows us to pull all elements that fit the query. And we know that when we do query selector all, it pulls back all of those elements, but it also searches the document in the order that the document was parsed from our HTML, and we will get back a list of elements in the order that they were generated in the DOM that match what's shown in the browser. So really good information right here for basic parsing of the DOM and getting access to HTML elements. Now, modifying those elements, we'll get to that in an upcoming screencast.